I'm Nat, and I'm from Exceptional Individuals. We support neurodiverse individuals flourish in the workplace, supporting people with dyslexia, apraxia, autism, ADHD, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette's, OCD, and all the other lovely variations in between. And we have been running these free webinars every single week for a year, which is ridiculous how we're able to churn these out, but hopefully the quality remains nice and high. So as always, this is what we mainly do, but today we're taking a bit of a deeper dive into the world of dyspraxia because, dyspraxia is an umbrella term. And when we're talking about dyspraxia, we're normally talking about DCD, developmental coordination disorder, though there's different names. We mentioned briefly about what we do. So the first one is, do I have verbal Oromotor dyspraxia? And this is different to your standard dyspraxia that everyone talks about. This is normally abbreviated to DVD, which I quite like. So it makes me think of a DVD. Now, the first question I want to ask you is this. Which of these have you heard of? Developmental verbal dyspraxia, articulatory dyspraxia, developmental apraxia of speech, or oral dyspraxia? Ask yourself, is this something which is ongoing and does it affect the person in a medium to severe way rather than just have they had this characteristic one time in their life, because we always do. When it comes to neurodiversity, it's about the amount of time and the level to which it affects. So Nigel says the first one, 1 and 0. No. What else we got? So we got developmental verbal dyspraxia. That's what we're talking about today. And not many of you have heard of it, which is a good thing because it means today's going to be brand new. Oh yeah, 1 and 2. Got yeah. The second one is articulatory dyspraxia. That can be when it's very difficult to articulate yourself, get the words out. Developmental apraxia. Apraxia is another word which is used quite a lot in terms of dyspraxia and oral. All of these are the same thing, but a different name, more or less, apart from oral dyspraxia. So believe it or not, there is a difference between oral dyspraxia and verbal dyspraxia. One is delays in speech and not being able to talk so well. And the other one is like a delay in the movement of your mouth. So the mouth not being able to make the right shapes, like the ooh, ah, the rolling. So they're just kind of different things. Helen says, not heard of any of them? Do not worry. Most people have not. But say if you have dyspraxia or you love someone with dyspraxia, it's good to know what one might relate to them a bit more because you can tailor the support. Stephanie, apologies, not heard any of them. Well, that's great. I mean, after today, hopefully you will. We're going to be focusing on DVD today. And as I mentioned, it's that one. But also in America, they call it developmental apraxia of speech more commonly. And it can also be known as articulatory dyspraxia. Basically, dyspraxia has a very confusing history when it comes to naming conventions. Technically, dyspraxia can refer to an injury as well. This is why doctors will typically use developmental verbal dyspraxia or developmental coordination dyspraxia, just because it really leaves no room for interpretation on what the person is talking about. So we're going to be going into a few of the classic characteristics, and hopefully by doing this, you'll soon see for yourselves how this is different from your bog standard dyspraxia that most people refer to. And obviously, this is going to be very much about phonologics, speaking and sound, opposed to fine motor coordination, which is normally related to dyspraxia. So remember, dyspraxia isn't just about coordination. It can also be about speech. And today we're focusing on the speech side. So which one is not a pure vowel sound? And interesting, yeah, all of you got that right. And it's quite interesting because if you've ever gone on dictionaries, they'll write things in these weird hieroglyphic labels, and that's to let you know how words are meant to sound. Because obviously letters can mean a, b, b, ka, there's more sounds than there are letters, and when you join them together, different sounds can happen. So yeah, a pure vowel is your A, E, I, O, U. Now there are a couple of dodgy vowels, like, sometimes Y likes to pretend to be one, but on the whole, they are the main ones. Now, someone with DVD may struggle in order to pronounce their vowels, or they might skip vowels or add vowels. Now, this obviously can vary depending on accent, because different accents pronounce words differently. So next one is, what is a word that you like the sound of? And when we talk about neurodiversity, it's particularly autism, we talk about sense information. And it's not just about things that disturb or disorientate people. It can also be things that they like the sound of. So are there any sounds that you like to hear? Like onomatopoeia, Kit Kat, teapot. So are there words that you just like to say, not because of any particular reason, but just because you like the sound of them? Jack in the box, kangaroo, hello, words that you might kind of elongate or like say. And you'll notice a lot of people with autism do this. They'll say words that are longer or sharp, sharp, and it's just because they like the sound of it. Like sometimes you like the feel of fabric, or the taste of food. You can also like the sound of certain words and pronunciations. Yes, Sanjan, onomatopoeia. Well done. Rachel says, Kiki, my son's nickname. I like that. Moist. Oh, isn't that a lovely one? Plymouth. Quadrupedifera. Potamonostros. Oh dear. Plunge. Disembark. Oh, I love the word discombobulated. Husk. Fabulous. Sizzle. Bonny. Nice. So I feel like these webinars, people love to point out how bad I am at pronouncing. But no, again, these words, and this is a really common thing for people who might have verbal dyspraxia. It's, yes, they may struggle with certain words, but on the other hand, there may be other words that they like the sound of. So they might be might have a very strong repetition, or they might put more emphasis on different characteristics. So you might assume that they're just pronouncing it wrong, but to them, they're very intentionally doing it, but they're doing it for a different reason. The reason isn't to communicate, it's simply for the pleasure of audio. Okay, the next one is, what is a word you always struggle to pronounce correctly? We've all had these words, and my list could go on forever. I've always struggled with the word soldier and shoulder. Millennia, Atlantic, Pacific, and you get the idea. So words that you continuously struggle with. Oh wow, interesting, April. So we've got journalist, salad, girl, performed, tent peg. Oh yeah, that philanthropist, philanthropic. I always struggle with that one.
Hi Nat, it's Rosanna. The one I can't see is Pacific.
Yeah, I struggle with that a lot. Pacific. But yeah, great to have you. Biscapan. This is really interesting because, again, people can really struggle with certain pronunciations of words, and it's key to understand where that difficulty is coming from. Is it from like a dyslexia point of view, where it's someone looking at the words and kind of interpreting it different in their head, or is it someone who is able to work out the phonologics but still pronounce the word different? Now, the English language is an interesting one because there are certain words which are spelt the same but can sound different in different circumstances, words that sound very similar, or words that have different pronunciations. And it's interesting to see when you look at data about how dyspraxia, particularly verbal dyspraxia, affects people in different countries with different languages and different sounds. Oven. Nice. Girl. Okay. Everything, lol. I feel you on that. So yeah, as you can see, the time of the day can affect it as well. And this is a real big misconception when it comes to neurodiversity. People think, well, I've seen you being able to read. I've seen you making eye contact. You're obviously not dot dot dot. But the thing is, yes, it is a lifelong condition, but how much it affects you can very, very much depend on your mood, your state of mind, how you're feeling in that day. So just because someone isn't shown the characteristics 24/7 does not mean that it's not a real thing for them. The next one is tenses. So do you know your times? On this one, I just want you to order in terms of tense, which one you think comes first and which one you think comes latter. So let's start with the past to the future. So here I've got, I watch Back to the Future every week. I'm watching Back to the Future now. So you would just pick, you'd put whichever one comes first in terms of tense, and the latter one secondary. I hope that makes sense. I watch Back to the Future every week. I'm watching Back to the Future now. I watched Back to the Future yesterday. I have just watched Back to the Future. And obviously I'm trying to make this really difficult to give you a sense of empathy on what it can be like. You may have noticed, those of you who have people in your life who have developmental dyspraxia, that they can often get their tenses mixed up. And it's really, I suppose it comes down to where the brain likes to find quick connections. It likes to get to the point, it doesn't like messing about. There are a lot of different tenses. You think there's only past, present, and future, but there's like the real present. I mean, I can't name them all, but there's a lot of different tenses. So let's see how we did here. I watched, obviously, yeah, past, Back to the Future yesterday. I have just watched Back to the Future, near enough present. I'm watching Back to the Future, just present. I watch Back to the Future every week. That one's more of a statement, isn't it? But yeah, that looks pretty right. So this is another common characteristic. It might be saying, you know, like, say you've just been to the park, you say, oh yeah, I'm going to the park, when actually you have already been. So if you commonly get them mixed up and confused, that's a very classic characteristic. The next one is, what do these words all have in common? Read, live, wind, polish. Do they all have one syllable? Do they all have two possible pronunciations? Or are they all homophones? Oh, good to see you, Sanjan. We normally don't get the pleasure. Okay, so most of you have two possible pronunciations, and you would correct. So read could be read, or it could be read. Live could be live, or it could be live. Wind or wind. Wound or wound. Polish or Polish. The English language is really confusing. So all these words, depending on the sentence, would determine how you pronounce them. But people who have developmental verbal dyspraxia could very well find this incredibly difficult and quite consistently use the wrong word. So you might say, I read a book, I read a book, or live, I'm live right now on YouTube, or it's very windy today. So an example of a word that has multiple meanings. See, these are just, they're the same word, but pronounced different. So there is a difference. The next one, you may have not heard of this. I had before I did the research for this. Really interesting. The glottal stop. Has any of you ever heard of the glottal stop? It's a type of sound that we make, and it even has its own symbol, like a question mark without a full stop. So a glottal stop is something which a lot of people who have developmental verbal dyspraxia will add or take away when it is appropriate. Examples could be setback, fitness, Latvia, clipboard, background. So first of all, to try and make this sound, because it is a difficult sound to make, Stop the airflow in your throat without choking yourself. Then try holding your breath, not within your lips or tongue, but within your throat muscle. So this bit, you kind of want to close this. Fountain, 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 sit back, fitness. Look, so you kind of hear it's like a bit of a high-pitched squeak. Obviously, it's more subtle in day-to-day life. Background. And it's normally the T is a different sound. So it's kind of like where you stop the airflow and it's almost like a hiccup sound. And to put this in real practice, someone who might struggle with certain types of speech might say, sit back, or fitness, or, they'll either add extra kind of like, we'll call them hiccups, extra hiccups in the word, or they'll remove them. So in words like fountain, background, clipboard, they all should have the globber stop, glottal stop. Do you often get told you take a long time to say words? Do you ever get told you're squeaky? Do people struggle to understand you? Great, nice. And going through, all of these are again classic signs of verbal dyspraxia. So not being able to regulate your volume. We all know people who, you're in a setting and they're just talking really loud and they're getting louder and louder and louder, and you're like, lower the volume. And this is because they really struggle to regulate that. Again, very, very closely aligned with types of autism. And you can also have a thing where you're just too quiet and people are always asking you to raise your volume. Thinking about, when like movies aren't synced properly and the volume just changes all the time and it's really difficult to listen. Having that regulation is a real big challenge for certain individuals. Next one, I take a long time to say a word. Now, this could be in two different ways. One, it takes a long time to think of the word, process the word, and get the word out. Or the opposite, or not the opposite, but an alternative, is you say a word, but you prolong it. So, how are you doing today? I'm doing okay. And they come from the exact same root, but one person is trying to fill the negative space in order to stop people interrupting them. Politicians do it quite a lot. And the other one is just withholding talking until that has been fully processed. The squeaky one is kind of about the glottal stop that we previously mentioned, because you might, for instance, like the way you move your vocal cords, you might do more dramatically. Now, whether this is because it's inherently part of vocal dyspraxia, or whether it's similar to what we mentioned earlier about liking the sound of certain words. Just like you can like the sound of certain words, you can also like the movement of certain sounds. So, because you're doing something physical to your body, it's giving you a different sensation. And the last one, people cannot understand me. That kind of accumulates all of it. It could be too muttering your words, stuttering, too loud, too quiet, taking a long time to say a word. All of these can result in poor communication, or the communication that we've come to expect from people at the very least. So we've got, Rachel says, it takes me a lot of time to get my words out or explain it to someone. Nice. Nigel's yes. And hopefully we're getting a nice bit of repetition now, so it really hits home on what we look for verbal dyspraxia. Do you ever have unintelligible speech / under-pronounced words? Like skip a couple of letters. It's like, how you doing, love? But in a way which people are like, what are you saying? So an example, you might say tup instead of cup, because you're just either missing a pronunciation or mispronouncing it. Another one is, instead of saying gas, I'm filling up my gas tank, you say I'm filling up my das tank, because you've missed that kind of like that hard vowel. You might say boken instead of broken, water instead of water. Now, we know that by taking the fastest route, sometimes we can become unintelligible, so people can't understand us. For me, I'm always mispronouncing certain words like don't or out, you know. But when I re-watch the videos of the recordings, I'm like, how did I not even notice I mispronounced that? And because it's a very automated process, and it really isn't someone can help. Yes, you can have training, but as you become an adult, the flexibility of your white and grey matter in your head becomes a bit stiffer almost. So it does become more challenging. This is why getting support when you're in your early years definitely has an advantage. And last one I think we're going to do is which of these co-occurring characteristics do you resonate with? So these are all ones that overlap with a lot of the other neurodivergences. The first one is family history of speech difficulties. What we're pretty sure is that they're hereditary. So there are certain characteristics that run through the family. The next one is delayed language development. So did you learn to talk much, much later than your peers? I know for myself, I was about 5 when I started speaking coherently. You try having a name like Nathaniel. I kept calling myself Flannel for like 10 years. We go by Nat now. So it is a challenge. And it says delayed because it means you don't have to stay that way. Like you pick up over time.
Can I say something? I don't know what it is. I think when I become anxious, and I think it's probably in our family's genes, that when we start to stutter, and we want to bring it out so quickly that it doesn't make sense to the other people. And people at the other end are hearing and say, "Can you slow down, please? Because we can barely hear you." You start stuttering, and it's like you've got a stammer in a way, and it's very hard for the person to understand what we're seeing. So is that genetics or is that nerves? Or?
It's very likely to be genetics. I mean, nerves can definitely make it more pronounced. I'm always doing it. So typically, as your brain is processing faster than the muscles and the motions in your mouth are able to keep up with. So sometimes you might say 2 words and kind of smudge them into one. I think smagged. I once said I went to slam the door and I just smudged the door. So I merge words together. The way you're thinking of words, and you might say the word before the word you should have said. So instead of oh, good morning, you might say, oh, morning good. And it's just because your mouth tripped up on itself, because think of it like a massive traffic jam of words, and there's only a tiny tunnel for the words to get out of, and sometimes the words will just kind of quickly drive around, and as a result, a big old mess. So it's not something you can help really. It's something you can get better at and improve, but it is very much part of you. So Sanjan says, yes, sometimes especially motor coordination. Oh, Joe says, I have elements of hyperlexia. Interesting. For those of you who do not know, hyperlexia is kind of opposite to dyslexia, but more closely related to autism. It's when you're able to typically read and do things ahead of others. So maybe rather than having a delay, you might have an advantage. But it's not all good news, because normally some things you can do sooner than others, but then other things take a hit as well. My verbal skills are much more advanced than my writing. Yeah, and it can vary in terms of how it presents itself. So hyperlexia might also mean you can't ignore words when you see them. You just have to read them, which can be distracting and cost energy. That's a really good point as well, and I've not normally mentioned that one, so I appreciate you bringing that up. Where else do we get to? Delayed early speech, babbling. So again, some you might call talking more infantile. If you think about it, speech is difficult. You've got to think of it, then it's got to kind of come through the pipes, and then it got to tell the muscles in your mouth to make the same shapes. And then you've got get the different tonal and the air variations. Then we've got poor motor coordination. This goes back to your classic dyspraxia, which most people have heard of. And this could be not just about riding a bike, doing sports, being clumsy, but can also relate to speech. It's that one action and the other action, the input and the output, aren't closely aligned. Difficulties with reading, exactly, that could completely work. Again, not the same way as dyslexia, but the output is quite similar. So the brain might skip certain words, it might take time to pronunciate words, not because you can't read, but that information on how to decode that certain word has not been organized in the most effective way in your brain. And as a result, it can make that stuttering when you read, either internally or externally. And slow progress in therapy. So what do we mean by that? Well, let's say you're off to get help, either in school, education, therapy. Difficulties with motor coordination might also mean that you struggle adjusting your intonation and the volume in which you speak. You might be able to, but it might require extra concentration and it might not work when you're nervous or tired. That is a really good point. But also, depending on if you're tired, if you're sleepy, if you're anxious, can definitely make those things even more. Now, that is most of it. Now, if any of you think, you know what, I think I might have this, getting diagnosed for it is a bit... Normally, they have to rule out all the others. So most people get diagnosed with dyspraxia because... developmental coordination disorder, because it is a lot bigger definition. It's more about a delay. People normally catch up. But in terms of when they catch up, it can vary dramatically from 7, 12, 18, even into later age. And you might be completely fine most days, but then one day when you've got more stress than normal, those characteristics could reappear. So again, it doesn't really disappear, but how you're able to mitigate it, you can slow yourself down. Now, slowing yourself down isn't going to be a natural response, but it is something that you can train yourself to do in most cases, but not all. And this is why adults seem to find life easier with these sorts of cognitive variations than younger people. But yeah, long story short, if you have it and you want to talk to us, you're more than welcome to. And if you're in the UK, there is support via the government scheme. I talk about it every webinar, but it really is worth doing. Rather than just thinking, I can't afford to have an assessment and I'm struggling in day to day, there is support available. And the best thing about it is you do not have to have a diagnosis in order to receive the support. If in doubt, give us a call, drop us an email, and we can kind of go from there. So now, any questions? Today's been a bit of a niche one, but if anyone has any statements, points, questions that they'd like to ask about it, more than happy to answer them if I'm able to. If not, I'll be able to come back to you with a good answer. Good question. What's the next webinar? So, let's actually go on to it. Manage my events. Actually, I'm going to give you a bit of a sneak peek into what's going on here. So, I shouldn't normally show you this, never mind. The next one is Dyspraxia peculiar. So we're going to be looking at the differences. And the next one, the last one of the year, is the future of neurodiversity. And this one is really interesting. And we're going to be looking at what science is being done. Where do we see the movement going? Are we looking at a cure? Are we looking at just people being more accepting? And then after then, we have a whole heap for the next year. Now, just so you all know, because I've noticed we've changed it now. So if you're able to pay, we encourage you to, but there's always a free option, okay? So if any of you are like, oh, I see you've got to pay now, you do not. There's still an option if you are a job seeker. So please do keep attending.
Now, can I ask, what if you're not job seeker? What if you're not a job seeker?
I would say if you're able to pay, it helps us run these. But if you are working, but you're in a situation where you're still struggling to get by or money is tight, then just click job seeker.
There'll be two options when you sign in.
There's always going to be two options. So remember, the webinar will always be free if you are not able to pay. But we're just trying a new method at the moment, which is trying to make these a bit more sustainable. How can we best support someone with this condition in a workplace environment? Good question. And the best thing you can do is to lay things out in multiple ways. So find out what is the best way to communicate with that person. Maybe speaking with them verbally isn't going to be the best method. Would they prefer typing? If they prefer typing, do that. I'm going to end it there today because, well, we have to end it at some point. But hopefully I'll see you at next week's on Dyslexia v Dyscalculia, going head to head. What's the difference? Where's the overlap? And anything in between. But thanks all.